Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another session of the Xcession Everything Service Management podcast. I'm Daniel Gilby, joined as always by my co-host and co-star Sunil Duggal.
Hello.
Hello, here he is. Slightly different tack we're taking today. We don't have a guest with us. However, what we're bringing to the fore today is some research that we've done here at Xcession around ITSM and ESM across the public sector. And more specifically, we wanted to look at what the total cost of ownership would be across a variety of metrics, which we'll go into in more detail as the session progresses. The reason being is that we really wanted just to get under the covers and see, beyond what the marketing hype is from the vendors, actually, what does it cost to have these things in situ? So we've got some great statistics to walk through, a bit of talking around our thoughts on that. Would really welcome your kind of comments and any kind of views you may have that come off the back of this. Just for awareness sakes, we're going to be talking to the statistics in great detail. And for those of you who are able to view us on video, we're going to be showing a few slides with some interesting looking graphs and so forth on there. So if you're able to, please do check us out on our YouTube channel as well. However, as mentioned, we will be talking in detail about the statistics themselves. Sunil, anything to add to that just before we get into the meat of things?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things around context here. So one is that for our regular listeners, you will know that last year we did a similar piece of analysis around the use of consumption of AI within service management. And we came out with some really quite interesting data points around how really that was very early doors actually in terms of adoption. And thinking about it, Dan, it makes a lot of sense that maybe this summer, 12 months on, that we revisit that topic as well and see how things have changed. So the sort of freedom of information request process is something that we have done before. It's not representative of the commercial marketplace because freedom of information request is only available in the public sector. But actually, as we'll go through, the data set is quite substantial that we've managed to get here. And so, there is likely to be quite strong inference that you can make into the broader commercial marketplace. So I would suggest that for all of our listeners who are in commercial organizations or indeed in vendors, right, then this is worth sticking with.
Fantastic. Okay, let's talk through some stats. So just to sort of set the scene, what did we do? So Sunil's mentioned we used the freedom of information mechanism, which we've done a few times before to try and get under the covers of things. And we approached NHS trusts and local councils across the UK. And really, we wanted to ask them some specific questions, things such as what IT or ESM solution they're using. And then for the period running from their financial year, whatever that might be, from 2022 to 2024, what were the costs associated with things such as the license and subscriptions, vendor support, any implementations or professional services costs that they've incurred during that period. So for instance, if it was implemented in the last, let's say in 2023, what did that implementation project look like? Another interesting aspect we looked at as well was tell us about the business scope that you're using the solution for. So is it just going to be used in IT or do you use it elsewhere across the organization? And then similarly, along the costs vein of thinking, what were the internal staff costs that are being incurred through running it day to day? So administration, support, development of the platform and similar. And then additionally as well, how many agents or fulfillers or whatever you want to call it for the particular solution in place do you have for that agreement? Now, we wanted to really just understand what is the overall total cost of ownership. I think we've been very clear about that from the outset. And we looked at some breakdowns here. Total per agent cost across the period, market breakdown by vendor, average TCO, total cost of ownership, average direct vendor costs, license, subscription, support, human capital costs, again by vendor. And then a little bit more exploratory, I suppose, what was the propensity for platforms to be used beyond ITSM? What could it be used in HR, finance and facilities and elsewhere? And then propensity by vendor. So which solutions were more likely to be used outside of IT to really get into that ESM mindset? So do you want to talk a little bit about what the data isn't right?
Yes.
Because it is representative, but there's a
Yeah.
few things we want to call out from the outset. Sunil, go for it.
Absolutely. So I think the first point to highlight is that, of course, there are many variables associated with this data and, in fact, the questions that we've asked. So to highlight a few, for example, vendors have completely different license SKUs, right? Some vendors charge one license for everything, others charge for different users, different types of users, access to different modules, etc. So we're not trying to break this down based on that, sort of level of granular detail. What we're simply looking at here is what is your total cost of ownership of that solution.
What's the bottom line, right?
Right, exactly that. Another thing that this is not supposed to be looking at is the value, right? We haven't asked any questions around the value that is being derived. So, for example, just because there is a higher total cost of ownership in an organization, that is no impact or statement whatsoever on whether that is a good or a not good investment in that technology solution. So, two key things there. I think the third thing is that there was some complexity, understandably, I think, in terms of some of the data that came back around staffing and or third-party costs. So, some organizations probably don't have an administrator per se for their IT service management solution. That's probably a role that's part of many different responsibilities that individual has. And so, it's difficult for that sort of organization to come back and say, well, 1/3 of Bob's time is spent on administering, the ITSM tool, so therefore that's X pounds per year. Similarly, where there were organizations that had third-party agreements that encompassed much more than the service management platform, so full outsource contracts, etc. So we have tried to, as far as is sensible and possible, take into account those variabilities in terms of costs, and just stick to the data sets that told us, the certain costs, I guess you could say, right, associated with the ownership of their IT or enterprise service management tool sets. So we're presenting this data without judgment. We're just simply presenting it as factual data given to us by the organizations that responded. And hopefully that's clear. And what we really want, I guess, is people to come back and make statements about the value. We want vendors to come and say, well, yes, we charge more per agent or in total more, but actually, this is why we do it. Ditto, we want organizations to come back and, and give us feedback, right, in terms of whether this is valuable or not. How do you I don't think this is a benchmarking exercise for customer organizations, but actually it gives them somewhere to start perhaps questioning their investment, the return that they get, and whether there might be better value solutions out there. Value doesn't mean cheaper. Value means something that delivers more back to their business.
And absolutely, and while Sunil's mentioned, it's not a benchmark, but it is information that could be used to assess your current expenditure, and then you can sort of see what else is out there and make a judgment call based off of the back of that. I think that's fair to say. So what did we get back? What is the data set to begin with? So we sent out just shy of 600 freedom of information requests. So that's comprising of 169 NHS trusts, 421 local councils, of which we got back 369 responses. So 94 NHS trusts have come back, as have 275 local councils. And some headline stats from those 369. We've got over 60 different solutions represented, custom built, in-house, and others, the more familiar names that we will get into. And for the purposes of this analysis, and really to kind of try and even things out, we've taken only the most frequently represented vendor solutions. We see investment ranging from nothing, £0, to over 2 million across this period. And the total market spend over those 3 years mentioned at the outset here is just over £50 million. So £17.5 million per year.
So just before we go into this next
Yep.
slide, Dan, so actually 2 years ago, we did an analysis of service management solutions in use in the marketplace. And I remember from that piece of analysis that there was a whole range of solutions that were being used, from we've doing it ourselves to solutions that I'd never heard of. I don't think you'd ever heard of some of them as well, all the way through obviously to the big major players like ServiceNow, etc. It would be interesting actually, Dan, and perhaps one for a follow-on session, to understand the 60 that we've seen represented now. Is that the same, more, or I would think less than the data set that we looked at 2 years ago? But I think as we go through this, right, we'll see that there's a huge number of solutions out there, but some of them are really not well represented. They may have a single use case, for example.
There's definitely that track towards consolidation, which we've seen over time as things change. But again, one for another session, as you say.
Absolutely. There's so much data that I think we'll break this out into a number of sessions. Yeah. So let's have a look at this chart, right, which for those listening not looking is the total market spend by vendor. So if you recall, the full spend as per our data set was just shy of £53 million across that 3-year period. What this chart shows us is that the total spend is dominated by 2 vendors. That is ServiceNow at 32.5% of the total market spend, and Ivanti at 17.7% of the total market spend. So less than 4% of solutions, 60 solutions or thereabouts in the data set. 2 of those account for 50% of the total spend. And to be honest with you, I was quite surprised, right, that it was as stark as this. We know that ServiceNow, for example, is a dominant player in the ITSM and enterprise service management space, full stop. But I was surprised to see how dominant it was within the public sector organizations that have responded to this. Of the remaining 50%, really the notable ones are, for example, Hornbill, Freshservice, Halo, ManageEngine, Alemba. I think probably names that would be very proud of their representation in the public sector space and the services that they're providing to those customers for many years. But actually, in terms of pound note spend, their take is very limited. So I don't know what your thoughts are, Dan, but I think this was really quite a surprise, actually.
It is surprising, and I can imagine a number of questions coming up from our audience is, well, that's all fair, well and good, but how many instances of ServiceNow, for example, are there contrasted with the rest? Again, we're going to get onto that, and I think equally quite surprising what we see a little bit further down in terms of spend. But let's tick on and look at some other aspects, and this indeed what we're going to talk about now kind of answers that. So for those listening and not watching, we're going to be talking about the market penetration by vendor and how that stacks across. Suddenly you had some great observations on this, I know.
Yeah. So just for clarity, what we are taking by the term market penetration is actually the number of instances by each particular vendor across the total number of instances that there are in the data set. So 369 instances, as we're terming it. So what you can see here, though, is a more even split. Okay, and we've done some rough calculation here. Just over 50%, 52.7% of the market is represented by the top 6 vendors, and as I say, in terms of number of instances. And in this data set, actually, the Freshservice, it turns out, is the market leader with 42 instances of their solution in play, followed by Hornbill and ServiceNow. So just thinking back to the previous chart where we saw that ServiceNow took 32 and a bit percent, 32 and change percent of the spend, actually that's represented by less than 10% of the total penetration or the coverage that they have in that marketplace. And I don't think we referenced directly the size of the Freshservice pound note market there, but obviously you can see that their coverage across this marketplace is much more substantial. Interesting to see, right, that Ivanti, again, a big pound note contributor to the spend, right, is slightly shy of 10%, a few less than ServiceNow. But actually, you can see some others like Halo start to take up some market coverage here as well. So an interesting data set. I will just call out, though, that there are, obviously by virtue of the fact that there's 60 solutions in the marketplace, right, there's lots of, organizations running, I don't know, Quest Solutions. I've never heard of Quest Solutions. I'm sure you're a fantastic solution, but you haven't got great market presence in the UK public sector. But then there are some bigger names, right, like BMC and Jira, Atlassian, for example, who also have a very small footprint. So it's a very dynamic space, I would say.
Very, very dynamic indeed. Let's now look at some pound note figures, some hard figures themselves. So what we've got on screen, folks, for you listening, is just a table showing the total cost of ownership. And what we've looked at here is we wanted to sort of make this representative. So we've only looked at instances where there's been more than 10. So where more than 10 organizations are using a specific solution, we've broken that down to give us there's like a top 10 list. And then given the instances, given the sum total spend, we've just done a simple calculation to divide that figure by the sum total to give an average total cost of ownership over the term.
And the term being 3 years, right?
Just the term being the 3 years, right?
Yeah.
So again, so I know you took this data away and had to think about it overnight and discussed it over family dinner and things like that. So it'd be great to hear.
My kids love it when I talk about IT service management spend in the public sector and the UK public sector. So for listeners, you will not be able to see that there is actually a small mistake on this slide, but for the eagle-eyed of you looking at it, you might notice it. I will, for the benefit, call it out as I run through this data set. I've just noticed it myself. So what we have done here is we have taken the top 10 in terms of number of instances, right? Not pound note spend, but in terms of number of instances. And as Dan has said, shown the average total cost of ownership across the term against these. What is interesting, before we look at the individual vendors here, but what is interesting is that there are 246 instances that make up that top 10. So 66 or 2/3% of the total number of instances are represented in this table, but it's 81.5% of the total market spend. So, come to your own conclusions on that. I would just say that, obviously shows that there's a substantial variety in terms of charging. As we've already said, ServiceNow represents the largest investment. And Freshservice represents the highest number of all instances. And what you can see here is quite a significant disparity between, for example, those two technologies. On average, listeners, ServiceNow across a 3-year term has an average total cost of ownership of £505,000. By comparison, the next highest, Ivanti, at £291,000. Followed by Alemba, slightly surprising maybe, at 154, then Hornbill, Manage Engine, and Halo between 106 and 125. Freshservice, that biggest representer in terms of instances, has an average total cost of ownership of £68,000. And just remember that total cost of ownership includes subscriptions, support costs, implementation or professional services
implementation.
Costs.
Yep. everything.
if required, and staff costs associated as well. So again, look, this is not a judgment in any way, but for organizations that, for example, have made an investment in ServiceNow, their expectation from a financial perspective around the run and operate, the maintenance of that ServiceNow system, plus the associated licensing and people costs, should be significantly higher than if they were to have chosen a different solution. And I guess that does mean that if they are running ServiceNow, their value expectations would also be different to if they were running a different solution. Dan, maybe we could just talk a little bit about info not given here and just explain what that is.
Yeah, sure thing. So within the freedom of information mechanism, you can ask questions of these organizations, and there are certain exemptions to responses that can be given. And a number of organizations deferred to not providing the solution they were using, citing what's called Section 31, and it's to do with cyber risk and cybersecurity aspects. However, they did give commercial information around that. So around their run costs, but they didn't say, we're using XYZ solution because there's potential for bad actors to leverage any flaws or software defects that they can then do something with it. But that's just still showing that whilst they've not provided the solution, they did provide run costs as attached to their ongoing ITSM and ESM platforms.
Yeah. There's one other thing that I think is probably worth talking about here.
Oh, you were going to tell us about the mistake.
Oh, sorry, excuse me. We've got ServiceNow as 12.01% of instances, but we know from a prior slide it's actually 9-point-something% of instances. So right. That's a mistake. But there is one other thing here, which I think is interesting, which is that again, not a value judgment, right? But if ServiceNow, with the exception of Ivanti or BMC Helix, is at least 3 times higher from a total cost of ownership perspective than any other vendor in the marketplace. Now, if you remember, BMC, I think, had 2 or 3 instances that were recorded. Ivanti 32. So ServiceNow's costs, right, have not actually really, I would suggest, significantly impacted on its ability to go out and win and maintain customers. So, again, not a value judgment, but it is an interesting data point, right? 3 times at least more expensive than, BMC or Ivanti.
No, that's a great observation. Definitely. All right, okay. Moving on.
Indeed.
So one of the other things we wanted to look at, you might recall from earlier, that we asked how many user licenses do you have? Whatever that would look like for the solution in place, fulfillers, whatever you want to call it, agents, and so forth, and do some extrapolation off of the back of that. Which, again, for you listening, we're showing a table here. For you viewing, you'll see this quite clearly, but we will walk through this. And again, some quite interesting numbers come to light. Sunil.
So, slightly unsurprisingly, given the high total cost of ownership of ServiceNow, that when you break it down by the number of agents, it's not users as in business users, right? It's agents as in fulfiller licenses. That ServiceNow is or has the highest average cost per agent, £3,659.
And again, that's taking into account everything. So it's
Correct.
Not like an agent license cost, but that is just summing up the overall total of the total cost of ownership against the number of users / agents / fulfillers. Just to be very, very clear on that point.
Absolutely, and again, it's across a 3-year term. So if you are investing in ServiceNow, your per agent cost per year will be somewhere in the region of just over £1,200. Ivanti, again, slightly unsurprisingly, given the sum of the total market spend, is next, just under £3,000, £2,941. But then you get into, I think, well, Manage Engine at 1,898, Hornbill 1,543. But then I guess you drop really into what perhaps is more, sort of, I guess a sort of slightly cluttered table, right? I'm sorry to the vendors that I've just described as, having slightly cluttered solutions, but it's a highly competitive space, right? You've got within, a few £100, right? Sunrise, 822 quid, going through to, Alemba at £1,300. You've got Halo in there, you've got Fresh Service in there as well. So, you're in a space there, I think, where, the sort of the costs that the vendors are putting forward are clearly very, competitive in terms of that total cost per agent, and that what they're clearly trying to do is to minimize, right, in terms of costs to try and influence that sort of value statement that they have for end customers. But again, I guess it is really interesting looking at the per agent cost that, ServiceNow is, almost, or definitely is more than 3 times that of Fresh Service, 3.5 times that of Halo. So, there is definitely, again, that investment consideration that needs to be made there.
Thank you,
So,
Sunil.
Dan, explain this one, or tell us what's on this side.
Well, yeah. So we're just moving on now to what we then looked at, given that we had that information about users and agents, is to kind of break that down, contrasted with the details we had back specifically to do with license and subscription. So we asked a very pointed, what was your license and subscription costs over the past 3 years, and we got a breakdown of that, and the most part from all the respondees on a per year basis. So similarly, we've summed all that up, and then we're looking at that flatly against the number of users and agents, which we've just talked about a few moments ago. Now, so this one's interesting to me because all the way through this, ServiceNow has been at the lead there in terms of the big numbers. But what we've seen here now is that I'm going to say second place, that's not the right term, but Ivanti has now come to the fore, right? Ivanti's taken the lead in the final stretches here.
Yeah, I don't know if the vendors themselves would consider them to be in the lead in this
exactly.
in this space.
Exactly. Vendors, if you've got a view, come back to us on that and leave a comment.
Yeah, what I think is really interesting is now, having stripped out the run and operate costs, the staff costs, third-party costs, etc. Right, that if you recall on the previous slide, we, and all the way through, we've been saying that, ServiceNow is at least 3 times more expensive than some of these other solutions. Well, actually, on a per license basis, it is not. Yeah, in fact, Halo was a very well represented 23 instances ITSM solution, right? Is only just under 50%, right, of the total subscription costs for ServiceNow. So I guess what this is telling us is that for some solutions, the people costs associated with the service are higher, and I don't think that this is telling us something that perhaps we wouldn't have expected, right? I think it's well known in the marketplace that running a ServiceNow system requires a greater level of administrative complexity and therefore skills to manage that. But the data bears that anecdote out. The data clearly shows that actually you can buy ServiceNow for, not a ridiculous overhead, right, in terms of subscription costs over the competition, but you do need to think very carefully about your ability to run, manage, and operate the system to drive value out. And if you recall, Fresh Service was, in terms of total cost of ownership, one of the more cost-effective solutions. But actually here, you can see that the license cost for Fresh Service is in fact the 4th highest. And if you recall, say, Freshworks go-to-market historically has always been very simple and easy to use software. Well, actually, the data bears that out as well. So if you're investing in Freshservice, maybe you don't need a dedicated admin or Freshservice manager. It depends, right, on your use case and how you want to use the system. But I guess it's just quite interesting, right, that you can see some of the kind of anecdotal stuff that you see in the marketplace, some of the vendor representation about themselves actually being borne out a little bit by the data set itself.
Okay, thank you, Sunil. So that's kind of concluded our look at costs from again a very flat bottom line perspective. Just to call out, if you're a vendor, if you're a user, you've got some opinions on anything we've talked about and or shown, please do get in touch. We're happy to share the data set with you and then talk about it in more detail as might be useful, right? One of the other things that we wanted to find out, and this all kind of tracks back to that value aspect that we've talked about here. There's a lot of hard numbers and inferences that we've drawn from those. So one of the other questions we asked was, well, how are you using this solution within your organization? Are you using it purely as an ITSM play, or do you indeed reach out to other parts of your business and leverage capability there to get those business outcomes that add the value? So we looked at business scope, and for those of you looking, you'll see a very heavily blue-weighted pie chart here. But for those listening, so now I'll talk through this if you like.
Of course.
So where respondees said, well, we're only using it in IT, that was 195 respondees, or 65% of these instances. So still quite a propensity there for just to use ITSM solutions in IT only, not broadening it out into the wider enterprise. But in the remaining 35%, or 87 respondents, 56 of these are using it in 3 or more business areas outside of IT. So the observation you made on this, Sunil, was that it would appear that once an ESM, enterprise service management strategy, is kind of arrived at, then multiple departments are very keen then to get on board because they see that value. I don't know whether you've got anything to sort of add to that.
I mean, it's just 56 of 87 is about 65% or something. Obviously, if you just saw me look down whilst I did that on a calculator quickly, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we haven't looked at here is longevity of solution, right? It may well be that, if you've had one solution for 8 years, then, over time that has slowly,
evolved
been adopted in other areas of the business, right? But it strikes me that as enterprise service management becomes a much more central digital transformation opportunity for organizations, that actually, as you said, Dan, once the strategy of the organization is that we want to consolidate workflows in different departments onto a single enterprise service management platform, that actually, you will see this increase. One observation I would absolutely make, though, is what a great opportunity this represents for incumbent IT service management vendors and partners like Xcession to go to these customers and say to them, look, you've got IT running on, let's pick Freshservice, you've got IT running on Freshservice. Freshservice has a brilliant ESM platform play, an approach that you could absolutely adopt. Here are many organizations that are using ESM solutions. You should be too, and here are a bunch of benefits associated with it. So penetration on its way. When you get going, looks like it's working, right? And there's lots of different business functions in here that listeners won't be able to see, but to just read some out. I mean, we've got something like clinical coding changes, for example, pharmacy new product requests, right? Data access requests. Many organizations use their service management solution for freedom of information requests, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
We've got
Patient booking
classic,
systems. There's a real wealth in here, yeah.
Absolutely, as well as the classics like HR, facilities, finance, etc. So, it just shows the flexibility that modern service management solutions have, right, to be able to go out into niche business areas and really offer a case management, workload management benefit.
100%. Okay. All right, folks. Well, we're arriving at the end of our kind of assessment of all of this. Again, just to, if you'd like to find out more, get in touch with Sunil or myself at Xcession. Again, happy to run through the data and share what we've got. Final kind of observation from us is to talk about that 56 out of the 30, or out of the 35% of 56 that sat in there who are using ITSM across in a more of an enterprise service management play. Who are the vendors that helped enable that? So we were kind of thinking, well, I wonder if there's some commonality here in terms of if you're using X solution, then you're much more likely to be using it across different parts of the business and the organization and deriving and driving value in that respect. But interestingly, and for those of you watching, you'll see it's quite an even spread here. And for those of you listening, it's quite an even spread here. And we'll talk a little bit about that and how that kind of breaks down. So I know there was some key points you'd kind of looked at here. So I'm going to pass the mic to yourself.
Thank you. So having just said what a great product Freshservice is in the enterprise service management space, actually out of those total 42 instances, only 3 organizations are using Freshservice in 3 or more departments. The market, so hey, Freshservice team, go get your marketplace. Great opportunity.
But just to chime in on that, you mentioned the point about longevity of solutions in an organization. So again, if you've had the same solution for a number of years, it is very likely you'll have kind of matured and perhaps expanded that across different departments. My observation on that would be that, and my understanding is that, to pick on Freshservice, relatively new entrant to the market. I know they've sort of grown quite quickly, so it could well be that there's a number of organizations who've not had the solution in situ for any degree of time, so perhaps it's on their roadmap. Would love to hear from you. Freshservice users out there, let us know your plans.
Absolutely. But what I would say, though, Dan, right, is that longevity might be a part of this, but it's not everything.
No.
Because the best that any vendor has achieved in this analysis is Topdesk, who 25% of their customers have extended into 3 or more departments. And honestly, and well done Topdesk for being at the top, but actually the bottom of this particular table, but you are the most successful in that regard. But actually, even that's not very good. Yeah, because actually there is huge opportunity in this marketplace. Public sector organizations have a multitude of functions within their organizations that rely on cases, whether that is wheelie bin collections, filling in potholes, freedom of information requests, clinical systems, estates management, fisheries and lake management in the Lake District. I don't know, right? There are so many different, apologies if I've upset anyone, but there are so many different use cases, right, that in these organizations today will be managed by mailboxes and spreadsheets.
Yeah.
So actually, I think it is incumbent on not just customer organizations, but on vendors and on partners like Xcession to go out there and to support this digital transformation activity. Yeah, there are so many benefits from being on an ESM solution over spreadsheets and mailboxes, right? But we need to go and make it happen. And IT departments, right, supported by vendors and partners in these organizations, also need to make it really simple and easy for business stakeholders to engage in this transformation and to onboard onto the platform. So I think huge opportunity here.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more, Sunil. Well, folks, that is it in a nutshell. thank you very much for listening. If you've made it this far, thank you again. On the final note, again, if you'd like to find out more about the data, ask us some questions, please do reach out. We're both on LinkedIn. And thank you for listening. See you next time.
Well, just before we go, if you are a
Sorry.
if you are a customer and you are looking for some consultancy on how to, change, review the marketplace, look at different IT or enterprise service management solutions, expand your own service management solution out into the broader enterprise, well, that is what Xcession does. So please come and talk to us.
Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Bye-bye.